Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurudevo Maheshwara, Gurureva Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Chinmayam Yatiyat Sarvam, Trailokyam Sacharacharam, Tattvam Darshitam Yena, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Tvameva Mata Sapita, Tvameva Bandhusya Sakha, Tvameva Vidya Dravidam, Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva Deva, Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva. Jai Guru. Om Sahana Bhavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So we started our journey through Narada Bhakti Sutra last week. And we started with this first section, which defines what bhakti or devotion is. And Narada says it's of the nature of prema, divine love. So we're not calling ourselves yogis for this class, we're premis. We're lovers of the Lord, lovers of the Infinite. And we talked a little bit about God's love for us. And we talked about the ancient early image for the infinite of Surya, the sun, one of the oldest in the Vedas. I like it because it is the nature of the sun to always shine on us. The sun is not capricious. It doesn't like one person and dislike the next. Yet we don't always feel the sunlight. So for example, today it's overcast in Oakland. It's cold and I cannot see the sun. Has this affected the sun at all? No. The clouds are in the way. So also, if we don't feel God's love, something's in the way. What's in the way? Ahankara, karta, bhokta, my egoism, my belief that I am the doer, I am the experiencer, and all of its ramifications. Kama, craving, karma, obligatory action, krodha, anger, bhaya, fear. These are the clouds of false identification that shut us off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Any thoughts on this? It's so important to understand. I don't feel close to God. Who moved? Not God. You can't earn God's love. You don't deserve God's love. You can't achieve God's love by being a goody-goody. The love of God, the mercy of God, the forgiveness of God, the grace of God is a constant. Any thoughts on this? And then we had a definition of it that prema, divine love, is of the nature of amritam, immortality. And we talked about it having this secondary meaning of juice, of nectar. Then I talked about the wonderful statue of the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And I haven't looked at it in a long time. And I misunderstood one of the symbols. I confused it with another statue. There's a figure with what looks like an arrow. It's actually supposed to be a spear. And it isn't Cupid, it's an angel. And he actually is smiling in the thing. And the imagery is taken from one of her visions when she talked about seeing an angel, and the angel had the spear with a burning tip, and he poked it into her heart, and it was a divine pain and a divine ecstasy all at the same time. So that's the imagery of that particular statue. Any thoughts on that before we go on? All right. So are we on 5 or 6 now? 6. Will you help us out, please, Aditi?
Yeah. Yajyatva matto bhavati sat stabho bhavati atma ramo bhavati.
Yes.
Having known which devotion, man becomes intoxicated, silent, and enjoys in the self.
Yes. So we have this marvelous expression, Atma Ramano Bhavati. He or she or they revel in the self. So if you look up at the wall there, there's the dude, Ramana Maharshi, Ramana Maharishi. That's actually what his name is. Ramati means to revel. Or the god, Rama, he who revels. He who revels. So this is the difference between our study being just an intellectual pursuit and dropping into something that's experiential. In Viveka Chudamani, we have this wonderful section about the qualifications of a fit student. And after that, there's a wonderful couple of verses about the qualifications of a fit teacher. He should be Shrotriyam, full knower of the scriptures. So he has a means of knowledge to wield, so we can take you there. who's a full knower of the Supreme. Doesn't mean, oh yes, 20 years ago I took LSD and I had an experience of the self. No. Constant experience all the time. And the next phrase is, and has retired into the Supreme. So the woman of wisdom has this incredible gift, trick of being able to just let go. Some used to call it tune up the mind. So she can revel in the self. Now, some people confuse that with the emotionalism that one sometimes experiences in a religious environment. So, for example, if you go to a contemporary evangelical Christian church, in the lights, and they have the rock band going, and everybody's swaying, and it's not much different than a rock concert or a ball game. People are emotionally engaged, but that's not the same. Or we have a term in English called charisma. Someone can be a very charismatic speaker. It can be, oh, but that's not the same. In this Atmaramana, the mark of it is when you enter into it. You know it is your own self that is the source of this. The teacher can show you the awakened state of mind, but it's yourself. So here Narada brings us into a connection that the goal of the path of bhakti, to love God until you disappear, is the same as the path of the Vedantins, where you inquire into yourself so that both God and you disappear. The fruit of both paths is the same. Now, when it comes to knowledge of yourself, you either see it or you don't. It's like one of those puzzles you see in the funny papers on Sunday where you look for the bunnies in the picture. There are 13 bunnies in the picture, so you can find them. You either see them or you don't. or these optical illusion things? Is it two vases or faces? You know, if you look at it one way and the other way, you either see it or you don't. So you either see that it is you, it's your very experience of I, or you don't. But how deeply the mind can revel in the self. There's no end to that. Now, there's a very famous scripture called Yoga Vasishta. Some of us have studied the Yoga Vasishta Sangaha, the essence of Yoga Vasishta, which we're going to start again in September. But in that scripture, there's a very, very famous section called the 7 stages of knowledge, the Jnana Bhumikas. Any of you remember those? So it goes through the various stages of knowledge. Now, here's a very interesting thing. There's a wonderful little book that I just love. It's called The Spiritual Teachings of Ramana Maharshi, has a foreword by Carl Jung. It's just questions and answers, much like our Nisargadatta Maharaj text was. Very short book. And one of the questions that one of his disciples asks is a reference to Yoga Vasishta. Nobody says anything about it. And the question is, Bhagawan, which of the 7 stages of knowledge does the jnani belong to? And we would think that, well, it must be the 7th. That's the highest supreme. And Ramana Maharshi's answer is very interesting. He says, to the 4th. And if you go through the scripture, it clearly says the 4th knowledge of yourself. And then the disciple says, if that be so, then why have 3 more stages superior to it been articulated by the scripture? Isn't that an interesting question? Bhagawan's answer is, these are not conditions of bondage and liberation. Liberation takes place at the 4th stage. They have to do with the experiences of the realized person. So to try to articulate what they are, you have knowledge of yourself and you're a 3rd class jnani. You may have what we call tenuous knowledge. You have times when you're tripping around in the world and you know you are Brahman. But then for some reason you lose it. You forget. Ignorance covers the mind, and then you suffer like every other person. You think you're a person, the world is real and has the power to afflict you, etc. And then at a later point, you come to, oh God, that was such a terrible thing. I was deluded. Nobody know that state. It's like a bad dream. You're the lowest order of jnana. Not really a liberated soul yet. Then there are people who have sthita prajna. They're always aware. Aham brahmasmi, I am Brahman. But the surface of the mind still engages to some degree in the world. But you know that it's always just illusory. You don't get caught up in the mind's reaction. Then there are those who see the world only dimly, very dreamy, hardly noticeable. Mind is always deeply immersed in the sun. Then there are those great, great saints. The one that comes to my mind is like Ananda Mahima. Most of you are too young to remember her. She was a mid-20th century saint. She had no disciples, only devotees. But she was immersed in samadhi so deeply that even her physical needs had to be cared for by others. People had to sometimes feed her and stuff like that. She was just gone. Just gone. Now it's interesting. Some scriptures say that the highest state is when the jnani functions in the world, knowing it's all an illusion, has a mind that interacts just like everybody else. You think about King Janaka, or Swamiji was a jnani of that order. Other scriptures say, oh, it's the one who's just gone, lost in samadhi. But what Bhagavan says is very important. He says these post-enlightenment samadhis are not to be gained by mere will or effort. If you're struggling to attain these states, you're not even a jnani yet. The mark of a jnani is they've given up on struggle. They are karmic. Has to do with punya, merits accrued in other lifetimes. So if you are drawn to a life of deeper and deeper introversion, knock yourself out. Revel in the self. Any thoughts on this? What this does is explain why we seem to see a difference in various jnanis. I can remember back in the 70s when I was in the ashram, a lot of the kids in the ashram had these weird ideas. Well, Swamiji may be realized, but Baba Muktananda is fully realized. He's more realized than Swamiji. And then, oh, but Guru Baba, he's completely fully realized. So he's higher state, stuff like that. So we see these jnanis and we see that there seems to be what appears to be a difference, how powerful they are, how high we get around them. But moksha, liberation, you either know who you are and you leave the rest to the Lord. Any thoughts on this? All right, next verse. Next sutra, excuse me.
Chapter 1, Section 2. Bhakti, love divine, uniqueness of love divine.
Aha.
Love by nature is sacrifice, and so it is never desirous. A relinquishment that renounces all actions, worldly or religious, a relinquishment that feels oneness with him and neglects contrary things, a relinquishment that performs actions, worldly or religious, if congenial, and neglects those to him when uncongenial. May protection of scriptures be ours to guide till the strengthening of convictions. May protection of scriptures be our duty to lead when one conviction is gained, or else there is a fear of fall. So long only our worldly duties, saving eating and such others, they remain till the body remains.
So let's pull this apart. Let's start at the top, the first idea.
Love by nature is sacrifice, and so it is never desirous.
Yes. So let me give you a definition in English of love. From the standpoint of our worldly relationships, love is genuinely wishing the well-being of the other. Swamiji used to say, most people speak love with their lips, but have lust in their hearts. What is the difference between love and lust? Lust is when I want something back. We can think in terms, of course, of the sexual denotation of the term, but there are connotations. I want approval, I want attention, I want you to hear me, I want you to acknowledge my needs. That's not love. That's lust. That is, my affection is tinged with desire. Now, the word sacrifice in English comes from the Latin, and it means to make something sacred. Sacrifice is related to a sacrament, to the word sacred, all related. So here, our love of God also should not be tinged with desire. I was talking with a person yesterday, and her uncle has given her a bunch of mantras to do. He's an astrologer. And these are mantras to gain wealth and for happiness, etc., this sort of thing. No blame, no blame. But many of us think that what meditation is about, what a mantra is about, what puja or ritual is about, is getting stuff. And here Narada is saying, that's a lower form of devotion. Oh, I do puja every day. I do puja to Lakshmi so that I'm wealthy. That's not devotion. Oh, I'm very, very devoted to Lord Ganesh. I want to make sure I pass all my classes. That's not devotion in the highest. Or in the Christian traditions, most people think that God is a combination between Santa Claus and a traffic cop. Listen carefully. The way in which you pray reveals your theology. You may think, for example, God is omniscient, omnipresent. I'm a monotheistic person. But in a crisis, oh God, please change something. What you're really saying is, give me what I want. Few of us pray, not my will, but thy will be done. As if God's will isn't going to be done.
Mhm.
It's you and me who need to surrender to that knowledge. So this first idea, real devotion, is to love God for the sake of God, not for what you get out. Any thoughts on this? Next idea.
So that whole paragraph that I read is actually a summary of this section. So I think it's better. if we
Well,
go-
it is and it isn't.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go through it.
Okay. A relinquishment that renounces all actions, worldly or religious.
Yes. So here we are again going through the idea of karta, the doership. Lower level of this is I do everything for God. God's my employer, God's my husband, God's my wife, God is my children. I'm doing everything for God's sake. The deeper meaning is God is doing it all through me. As the Master Jesus said, I myself do no thing. It is the Father within that doeth the work. Surrendering our life and our will. Living from this deep intuition. Next idea.
A relinquishment that feels oneness with him and neglects contrary things.
So here we have some discipline. Remember, the word discipline comes from the same root as disciple and scissor. So we want to cut away out of our lives, out of our behavior, out of our thinking, actions, attitudes, and thoughts that create dissonance and difference that separate us. I once asked a very dear friend of mine who's a priest. I said, how would you define sin? He thought a moment, he said, anything that separates us from the love of God and the love of other people. That's a damn good definition of sin, in my opinion. So all of those things we endeavor to set them aside. Next idea.
A relinquishment that performs actions, worldly or religious, if congenial, and neglects those to him when uncongenial.
So if it's conducive to the furthering of the warming of the heart for God, secular or religious, it's It's okay. But if it's contrary to that, begin to let them go. What about going to a bar? Well, think. If you're going to a bar to get loaded and pick up somebody, probably not a good idea. But if a co-worker is having a birthday and they're meeting in the bar, and you want to acknowledge and care for this co-worker, go. So the worldly activity all depends on why you're there. Does that make sense?
Intention.
Yeah, very good.
May protection of scriptures be ours to guide till the strengthening of convictions.
So the scriptures are our ultimate authority. Where do we go for the wisdom of how we should live our lives? People have all sorts of good ideas. To use a worldly example, I've had conversations with people who don't know whether or not the vaccines are a good idea, and they do all this research on the internet. Oh, I read this article that said this, and this study said that, and blah, 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 blah. My suggestion is, I don't think that Facebook is an authority on medicine. Talk to your doctor. If you want to read something, read peer-reviewed articles by bona fide scientists. Let them be your authority. Same thing in the spiritual life. Protect. Where do we protect it? Between our ears. Shankara phrases it this way. He says in Vivekachudamani, who can argue for the scriptures and refute arguments against them. You don't do that at a cocktail party. You do it when the world says the goal of life is more, better, drug, sex, rock and roll. The one with the most toys wins. I'm not getting my needs met. Do the scriptures say that? No. All right. Is that all of them? In the intro?
No, there's more.
Okay.
Till the strengthening of convictions. May protection of scriptures be our duty to lead when once, that's it.
All right.
Yeah.
Next sutra.
Okay, there are a few more ideas in that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. When once conviction is gained, or else there is a fear of fall.
Yes, so we protect the scriptures. We keep going over these ideas until the conviction that this is true is gained. And if we don't, we're likely to fall from the path and not have steadfastness. Remember when we studied I Am That? One of the things that Nisargadatta Maharaj said over and over again, that he was earnest. Remember him using that term? I tell people I'm a crappy yogi. Oh God, the mistakes I've made, which really in the larger sphere are not mistakes. But the one thing I've done is I've been steadfast. Keep on keeping on. Same thing, Narada Bhakti Maharaj said. Don't worry about whether or not you're a good yogi or a good premi. Every day, a new day. Today, how am I going to love the Lord? Today. Next idea.
So long only our worldly duties, save eating and such others, they remain till the body remains.
So don't worry about the fact that you've got worldly things you need to do. Few of us are trust fund kids, meaning we've got to pay the mortgage or pay the rent. You have to have a job. Don't worry about it. It's not against your spirituality. Do your duty. Some of us have children. You have obligations, you have duties to do for your children. You fulfill those duties. He's talking here also, if you're a Brahmin, you are enjoined to do certain rituals on a daily basis. Don't worry about it, do them. But unnecessary stuff, let it go. Is that it on the intro?
Yeah.
Okay, for next sutra.
Sutra 7. Sa na kamayamana nirodha rupatva. Because it is of the nature of renunciation, there is no element of desire in that love divine.
Yes. So, when we love something, we are willing to renounce other things. For example, it's human nature to see someone that you're sexually attracted to and have desire arise. But if you're married or in a committed partnership, you understand if I go do that, I'm going to lose that which I really love a lot. So I'm willing to renounce that other activity. Susali, do you like sleeping in on a day off?
I guess, see, yes.
Yeah. But if you've got to be at work and you've got program calls to make in the morning, the alarm goes off and you go, oh, I don't want to do any of that stuff. I want to go stay in bed. What do?
I don't. I don't do. I get in trouble.
Say again?
I get in trouble if I do that.
But what do you actually end up doing?
I do what I have to do.
You do what you've committed to do. Yes. That's sacrifice. That's renunciation. But the impulse, the driver for our renunciation is always going toward what we love. I like to say we are healed not so much by what we turn from, but by what we turn to. When we solve the spiritual malady, the world straightens itself out. the solution looks nothing like the problem. I don't have any money. I don't know what we're going to do about the house. My children won't behave. Ah, love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Turn the rest over to Him. Yeah, but what about? See what happens. The solution frequently looks nothing like the problem. This is the deeper sense of what renunciation is about. We leave things that aren't about what our deep commitment is. Any thoughts on this?
Yes, I guess it's I don't know. The word that keeps coming back is like cheap religion is better than not religion. So like at least having
What kind of religion? Cheap?
yeah. But what I mean is like even having the desire for liberation involved and getting into the spiritual path is better than not.
Of course it is. We start with just the desire for liberation. We may not be able to do much with it yet. I can't tell you how many of my students don't meditate. No blame. Their minds are still too extroverted. No blame. Do karma yoga. In time, your mind will turn. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
All right, next one.
Sutra 8. Nirodhastu loka veda vyapa ranyasaha. This renunciation, indeed, is in the total giving up of all secular and religious activities.
Yes. So, in the end, these secular activities, these religious activities, in and of themselves, we let go of them. Now, we've nuanced that in the introductory parts. It depends on where you are in your life. If you have the great privilege of not having any worldly obligations, then you can take this literally. But Shankara says it this way. He says, giving up all ego-prompted desire and activity. What do I mean by that? If I'm acting in the world with the paradigm, with the idea, this is what I need to be happy. I insist on the circumstance in order to be happy. That's foolishness. But we do our duty. We do our duty. Feed, clothe, house your kids. When they're grown, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. Pay the mortgage till the mortgage is paid off, or you sell the house. You do your duty in the world. But that's different than operating from the standpoint, I must have it this way, or I can't have it that way. Any thoughts on this? All right, next one.
Sutra 9. Tasmin nananyata tadvirodhishu dasinta cha. In the Lord, wholehearted, single-minded devotion, and in all else that are contrary to it, complete indifference. This is the nature of renunciation. Nirodha.
So now he nuances this idea of renunciation. Wholehearted devotion to the Lord, to God, or the goddess if you're a deity worshiper. And not non-action, but indifference, meaning this samadrishta, this equality of vision. So, for example, Cicely, you and I were talking about where to go on a trip. Can you find the place where in your heart you're indifferent? Going here, going there, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Going, not going, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we don't express a preference. Let go. Doesn't mean being passive. My friend Susan and I have had this conversation. She has a friend who the only choice she's willing to make when they go to lunch is no. So the conversation takes place like this. Where would you like to go to lunch? Oh, I don't care. You choose. So Susan says, how about going to restaurant A? And the friend says, no, I don't like that place. Well, how about going to restaurant B? Well, it's too far away. Well, how about restaurant C? Oh, I don't like their blah, 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 blah. And it just drives my friend Susan up a wall. The friend obviously has preferences, but is passive. You catch the difference? So to say, oh, I don't care, you choose, and then say no, 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 is not equal mind, samadrishta, equality of vision. That's just abdicating responsibility for the choices. Do you see that? So we don't get into this passive kind of state where we in fact have preferences, but all we do is hand the decision making to another, and then we have the power to say no. That's not what he's talking about. Real indifference. State your preference. Works out groovy. It doesn't work out, let it go. Doesn't mean you choose and I'll complain. That's not what he's talking about. Any thoughts on this? None of you have ever been in that state, I hope, have you? Of human condition. Here's how I know these states. So this idea of renunciation is subtle.
You were talking about it on Sunday about in Gita about pride and the reason why like not stating my preference, or it's because a fear of rejection or fear of confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just basically fear.
Good point. Yes. Yogi wants to be fearless. It's wonderful freedom to walk through life, not walking on eggshells. Those of us who've grown up in families where there was like an alcoholic parent or an abusive parent are constantly on guard. Don't they? Isn't the psychological term hypervigilance?
Yeah.
Because you're always afraid you're going to piss a crazy person off. If that's the way we've been raised, we have to work hard to let go of that. Who is it who's going to be hurt? And we're really not in danger. All right, next verse.
Verse 10. Anyashrayanam tyago ananyata. Renunciation of all other supports is wholeheartedness and devotion.
So the word here is tyagaha, which I translate as abandonment. We have these two words, sannyas and tyaga, in the literature. Sannyas, I usually translate as renunciation, which is more of a deliberate act. I'm going to give this up. Tyagaha is abandonment. And the way I nuance this, I always think of like a child who's totally engrossed in playing with a bunch of toys, and then something else draws their attention and they go toward it. And the toys are left where they were. And you think about it. Or my classic image of the tricycle and the bicycle. When you were a little child, you had a tricycle which you really loved. Then you get the two-wheeled bike. You don't go through the process, I'm giving up tricycles because I'm a bigger kid now. You don't go through that process. You love your bike. And what happens to your attachment to the tricycle? Gone. That's tyaga. That's abandonment. So the premi abandons this world. I sometimes will say to people, I used to be a great hedonist. I was a great enjoyer of this world. Listen carefully. I still am a hedonist. It's just that the world got too small. I settle for poultry, trinkets, and baubles. It's so little. It's so little, just this little bit of juice for an enormous amount of work. We are not healed by what we turn from, but by what we turn to. The Master Jesus says, love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the rest will fall into place. You don't need to leave the world. Attach yourself to the infinite, and the world will leave you. The world will leave you. And you may already be having some of that experience. You may have social friends, and they're all worked up over the stock market or the politics or real estate prices or all this stuff. And it's not that you don't see it. You may watch the news or read the newspaper, but it's not important like it used to be. Who's had that experience? Yeah. It's not like you consciously made the decision, I'm not going to read anything below the fold in the New York Times. You don't make that decision like that. You may read it. Going on and on about Governor Cuomo. Click. Like, I'm really not interested in his sexcapades. Let it go. But turn your mind. How many more in this section?
It's 7 to 14.
So
We've
we
got a
just
few more.
finished. So
All right, going on.
Lokavedeshu tadanukulācharanam tadvirodha shudasinata. To perform all secular and religious functions that are congenial to him, and to have total indifference to all actions that are hostile to him. That is indifference.
So this is part of our viveka, our discernment, our discrimination. We want to move toward punya and move away from papa, move toward merit, move away from sin. How do we discern that? This is the definition I like to use. Anything that is conducive to quiescence of mind, that brings peace, is punya. Anything that agitates the mind, that grossifies the mind. It's a pretty good watchword. I frequently get the question, well, we're supposed to do God's will. How do I know God's will? Anybody ever had that doubt? Knowledge of God's will and doing it brings peace. Not that temporary lack of conflict, but peace. Now, these things will change over time. For example, things like diet. Oh, Jim, should I become a vegan? The scriptures say eat sattvic food. Well, if you start off on a vegan diet and the end result is you're agitated all the time, maybe not cold turkey right away. Maybe a better course is trust your body, really listen to it, and move toward that if that's what you want. Now, if you have an addictive relationship to food, that's a different story.
Jim,
Questions?
Yeah, I remember something that I think it was Thomas Merton that said that, because I always wonder, well, I want to know God's will for me. I want that knowledge, but and then that's my seeking, right? Like what's God's knowledge, what's God's will for me. But I think Thomas Merton said that at least having the desire to do God's will is it's enough, or it's having the desire to do God's will is God's will for me.
Well, the desire to do God's will sets the intention. Yes. That's your sankalpa. And even if you don't know the specifics, what's the opposite of the desire to do God's will?
My will.
F you, I'm going to do it my way. We all know when we're in that place. You've hurt my feelings. F you, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to set rules and conditions, and this is the way it's going to be. Anybody ever been there? Don't you know who I am? All right. Next one.
Sutra 12. Bhavatu nishchaya tartha durtvam shastra rakshanam. After having thus decided to live the life of wholehearted devotion, let there be protection of the scriptural teachings.
Yes. So again, after you've made your commitment to become a premi, a lover of the Lord, let there be protection of the scriptural teaching. What do we mean by this? Again, in the introductory material, we went through it briefly. It's not so much that, don't you dare put that scripture on the floor. It's a sacred Veda or the Bible. It doesn't mean that. Oh yes, I venerate the scripture. I put it in a very sacred spot in my mandir, my shrine at home. Do you ever read it? No. It sits there. Doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean that. Now, eventually the scripture is written in our hearts. But until we get to a point where we can trust that, we have lots of guidance. Couple places we can turn to. I've become quite fond of the yamas and the niyamas of Raja Yoga. There are 10 of them, 5 yamas, 5 niyamas. 5 of them have to do with internal attitudes for ourselves, and 5 of them have to do with our relations with the society. It's a wonderful place to start. We can do something like qualifications of a fit student. That's a wonderful place to start. It doesn't mean that you have to do this particular ritual and you need to make sure that your ashes are poured into the Ganges River or any of that kind of business. And for those of us who are Christians, I always think of one particular gal who I loved her to death. This little Filipino woman, and on Good Friday, when we had Stations of the Cross, she'd go all the way around the perimeter of the church. She was in her 80s, on her knees, making sure everybody saw that she did it. And then, God forbid, you did something she didn't like, she could be the nastiest person you can imagine. Things like purity of food. I always go to what Jesus said. We are defiled not so much by what we put into our mouth, but by what comes out of it. So when we abide by these scriptural injunctions, it's not so much about the inherent ritual itself. Far more important are these qualities of head and heart and behavior that we endeavor to move into our lives. Any thoughts on this? If you don't know the yamas and niyamas in Raja Yoga, it's very easy to find them online. I highly recommend that you take a look at them. They're a very, very good start to an ethical life. Any other thoughts? If you're Christian, one of my favorite places to go, the prayer of Saint Francis. Do you know this prayer, David?
Yes.
Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. I'm sure you know it. Oh, a very simple, gracious place to start for a way to find principles for an ethical life. All right, next verse.
Anyatha patitya shankaya. Or else there is the fear of a fall from the spiritual path.
Yes. I think we'll stop here and we'll take these last two on this section, right?
Yeah.
Don't you?
It is
Three.
only one. left.
Or
There's only one more after this?
yeah.
Okay, we'll finish it up then. So if again we don't have steadfastness in it, or we start making up our own yoga, then we're likely to stumble and fall. Now, have faith. No one ever really falls permanently. If you deviate from the spiritual life, you will begin to suffer as the consequences of stupid behavior. That suffering will bring you back. So, Susili, so your involvement in FA, have you had sponsees who fall off the wagon and start eating sugar and flour and all that kind of stuff, gain a whole lot of weight and feel terrible?
Yeah.
And do you beg them to come back to the program?
No.
What happens?
They come back on their own.
Why?
Because they gain all the way back and they're suffering.
Yes. The suffering becomes the great teacher. Suffering becomes the great teacher. In AA, we used to say, no one is more miserable than someone who's got a belly full of booze and a head full of AA.
Oh, yeah.
It destroys your capacity to drink with impunity. Or in Vedanta, once you learn the pleasure principle, what does it feel like to want something you don't have? It sucks. What happens when I get what I want? The suffering goes away. That's a taste of yourself. Really internalize that. This yoga's nuts. You go out there in the world, you can't be there in the world the way you used to. You know too much. Vedanta has ruined your capacity to enjoy the world in ignorance. Suffering. All right, and the last one.
Loko api tavadeva kintu bhojanadi vyaparasva sharira dharana pati. The worldly duties in the various social contexts are also to be performed only to that extent, so long as the consciousness of the external world continues with us. But activities such as eating and so on, indeed, will continue as long as the body exists.
Yes. So in terms of your worldly duties, as long as the world asks this of you, you work until you don't work anymore, until you retire. You take care of children until your children are grown and gone, etc. You do these duties in the world until they leave you. Don't worry about them. Maintain this samadrishta, this equality of vision. Turn your heart and mind toward. And in time, what's supposed to go will go. But some duties will always remain. Maintenance of the body. Always be there. All right, we'll end here, Tim. Any questions or thoughts before we sign off? Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Sri Guru Namaha. Hari Om. Thank you all.
Thank you.